was hosting an open mic in a bar, you
Mm.
know, and so bar shows are a lot different than a club show. Like at a club show, everyone's there to see the show. You know, at a bar show, some people are there, didn't even know there was going to be a show, you know.
Just there for 2-for-1s.
So, yeah. So this lady is there on a first date. So she's talking to him, not paying any attention to the show. So because she's not paying attention, she just heard me say autistic, didn't listen to the next part where I talk about being autistic. And then like 2 minutes later, heard me say retard strength. And so she just connected the two in her head without listening, without having the gap in the middle to connect everything. So she just flips out. She's like, "You can't talk about autism. You can't." And I was like, "I'm like, you might have missed this, but I am autistic, you know, surprise, you know." But that happening is actually why I added a joke into my material in between those two bits, where like there's a line where I kind of pause for a little bit and I'm like explaining why like people can't get upset, and I'm like, I basically say like I'm part, like, remember, I'm part of the protected demographic you want to be offended on behalf of. And so like adding that little like statement in there kind of like stops those people in their tracks. And I've had a lot more positive feedback than negative. Like I had so many people like coming out to like the merch tables after the shows and just coming up to say hi. I had a lot more like people like, "Oh, my son, daughter, niece, nephew, so on and so forth has autism, and that was really cool what you did." So I've had a lot more of that than that one Karen. You know?
Is that weird for like people to come up to you and like say you're an inspiration, or like you're helping them with that kind of thing?
It's super weird, but it's also like,
that's to melt your heart a little bit, right?
Yeah, like it's not a payoff I expected. Like I was always more concerned about like those, like the Karens. I was more concerned about being offensive. And I did during quarantine, I did like a Zoom workshop, and like there was a Q&A with Roy Wood Jr. from the Daily Show. And I asked him, like in that Q&A, I was like, "How do you write material around sensitive subjects?" And he was like, "Well, you know, be more specific." And so I told him, I was like, "I'm autistic. I have jokes about autism I want to tell, but I'm afraid they'll be offensive." And he gave me just great advice. And he like gave me like comedians to study, like Maria Bamford and Mike Birbiglia and Josh Blue. And he's like, listen to how they talk about, like when they talk about any sort of like medical condition or anything like that, they talk about their experience with it. And they're talking about like their condition. They're not talking about all people with their conditions. And so just getting that advice, that was kind of like the green light, is like, yeah, I'm definitely allowed to talk about this because I'm talking about me. Like I'm not talking about everyone.
It's like when people get offended by like someone's perspective, it's like that's that person's perspective. You can't be offended. This is what they thought. This is what they saw, and it always pisses me off when people get upset.
A lot of people that get offended are getting, like you say, getting offended on behalf of another group. And often like on a perspective that they're only assuming, you know. Right.
And that was what was so like, that's what kind of sucked about that woman. And also like what made her side the losing side of the argument was her response was like, "Well, the autistic people I know would never be able to get on stage and do that." We're like, so now you're assuming we're all the same. And that's where you fucked up. You know? And that thing is like, autism is like, I was talking about this with another comic one time. Like, it like a black comic can go on stage and tell black jokes, and the audience can immediately identify that they're a black person, right? But when you go on stage as an autistic person, the audience can't immediately identify you as an autistic person. One, because there's so many different ideas of what autism is. And two, it's not like there's not like a physical marker. Like, you know, it's not like we're all born with like a Harry Potter scar or something where you're like, "Oh yeah, look," you know. So there's always that part of it that you've got to contend with, versus like, you know, any sort of mental health thing. Like there's no way for you to prove it. You know what I mean? And the audience can't immediately identify it. Right. Yeah. So the audience just can't immediately identify it. So you have to win them over, and you have to.
I'm not even gonna like. When I saw you go on stage and you're wearing a shirt that said Captain Autism, I was like, what the fuck is this? Like, where's this guy going with it? And then you start talking. I'm still not entirely sure yet. And then I noticed your hand and like some of the mannerisms you were doing. I'm like, oh, and then you finally like you talk about you have autism, like, oh, this is all making sense now. I mean, is that like an intentional thing? Are you going out there to like kind of like shatter those like expectations and stuff, or
that wasn't my intention at all. My intention was more to like, especially when I first started and I first started telling those jokes about autism, it was more about like just kind of like unburdening myself a little bit, you know, and I didn't expect like those kind of responses like we were talking about. Like I wasn't expecting families like, you know, to be like, hey, like you impacted our family. Like who expects that from telling like, you know, like dick jokes, you know? But then it like when it started happening, that's when I started realizing, I was like, oh, like this means something to people. And I don't know. I had always thought about like because there are other autistic comics, like Hannah Gadsby is openly autistic. Jim Jeffries, you know, has his story like where he found out he was autistic, you know. So I just didn't think about it that way because I was like in my head, I was like, there are better examples than me. Like there are already people that have come before me, so I'm not gonna be that to people. But turns out excuse me.
Very cool.
Turns out people need it. And it's been really cool.
Come join the conversation, the show that you've been wanting. Keep it real with no filter. Weekly we share discussions. WWSD, interviewing creative guests, talking the creative process and sharing all the influences from TV and film. Emmy nominated and winning, yeah, they're coming through. Actors and comedians too, directors and writers, way more than a few. Masters of their craft, yes, tune in, you gotta see. This the podcast that you need, WWSD.